Hello. I think that we will start this panel. I don't know if everybody can come more closely. In fact, we have, initially we have 3 presenters in this panel, but I don't know what happened with the 2 people from Brazil, and we only have the presentation of Tyrell Andrew. And we will ask him to present. He's from the University of University of San Diego in this Department of Political Science and International Relations, and he will present this paper on politics and the environment at the Mexico-United States border. Thank you, Andrew, for being here, and I will give you 20-25 minutes to present, and after that we can discuss a little bit about your presentation. Thank you so much. Bye.
Good morning, everyone. Well, I want to thank our chair, first of all, and I want to start by saying I'm somewhat new to this area of study. My focus up until now has been on environmental issues in other areas. I've just, in the last few years, begun working at the U.S.-Mexico border because that's where I live now. So for me, it's quite personal, actually. I'm sure that our chair, who is really an expert in this region, can add a lot more, but I have spent quite a lot of time thinking about the environmental aspects, and those are not the aspects that many people talk about. When you say, what's happening at the border of the US and Mexico, that's not the first thing that most people think of. Looking at this picture, you can see so many issues in this one image. The differences, especially at this particular border between San Diego and Tijuana. The difference in population density, the difference in the social and economic factors, but you can also see some hints of what I'm going to talk about. If you let your imagination kind of run with this, you can probably guess at some of the environmental issues that the border is facing. You can see some of the natural landscape and a lot of the built landscape, and you can probably guess at some of the issues, or maybe you've heard a bit about these issues already. So usually when we're talking about the border, and I guess I should say I've received more American press than other press, although I try to read press from Mexico, of course, but also from other parts of the world, still largely because the current US administration focuses on these issues, but really it's been the focus for many, many years now. You think about a few things, and I'm leaving some things out here, but the major ones, trade, of course, a big issue, both NAFTA, the free trade agreement on the sort of macro scale, but some of the cross-border economies that are happening. And I'm talking about both formal and informal. I'm talking about things like maquiladoras, which are, American-owned companies operating on the Mexico side, but I'm also talking about the informal economy of many people passing across the border daily. Immigration, of course, especially now, and especially with some of the, my background before I got my doctoral degree was in human rights. I was a human rights lawyer for about 8 years, so I have to say, I'll say this from a human rights perspective, some of the shocking and I would say extra legal things happening around immigration right now. And the talk of a border wall, it's already existing border wall fence areas there, and of course the recent, and I'll just speak from the heart here, horrifying detentions that have happened, especially with children. And of course crime is often mentioned. Maybe it's a little overstated, or a lot overstated sometimes, but of course drug trafficking and human trafficking are probably the 2 big issues. But the issues I'm going to talk about today are the somewhat, I'll say somewhat because there are people working on this, working very hard, but the somewhat forgotten issues around the environment, around fresh water, around the shared coastlines, this both on the Pacific and the Gulf Coast, although I have more familiarity with the Pacific side. Air quality issues, which I think are really underappreciated. The joint risks and vulnerabilities around climate change. And this particular geographic area has some real vulnerabilities we'll talk about. And then ecosystems. You know, it's pretty easy to focus on the human side, but we often forget about the very sensitive ecosystems with many critically threatened and critically endangered species. And each of these challenges has the problem being siloed. What I mean by that is people are working on them, but they're working on them in their own particular way with their own particular focus. So someone who's working on the issue of fresh water may not think much at all about air quality. People who are thinking about biodiversity or conservation, you know, may not be thinking about some of these other issues in particular. They're all interconnected, so it would be almost impossible to not be aware, but often we're working, as we are in most fields these days, in a very siloed, very narrow way. And this means that we have a hard time connecting these issues together. These issues are also really exacerbated by the political, economic, and social interconnections and divisions. I don't want to just focus on the divisions, there are those, but there's lots of interconnectivity, and that also complicates these issues. So I'll talk first about fresh water, which is perhaps, I'm guessing, the most familiar issue for folks who are not so familiar with these environmental issues at the border. Many do know about the Colorado River and its usage in the United States. The fact that the U.S., if you can make out this pie chart, the U.S., each state in the U.S., apart from a couple of states that only have a small part of the river, all of the major states along the river take more water per state than Mexico receives, even though Mexico has the delta of the river. California, the state I live in now, is the big culprit here, and for reasons that are sometimes sympathetic. Quite a bit of the agriculture, I dare say most of the agriculture in some sectors in the U.S. occurs in California in the Central Valley. That's feeding a lot of people. It's also taking a lot of water. This is a fairly dry region, a very dry region, and without the water from the river, it would not be possible to have that kind of large-scale agriculture. Of course, the other thing that is maybe sympathetic, but probably less sympathetic, are the cities, sometimes thousands of kilometers away from the river, that are drawing from it for their drinking water and their industrial water use. Cities like my own San Diego, but of course also Los Angeles, Las Vegas, cities that are probably too big, if I'm going to be honest, that have grown beyond any semblance of sustainability and are reliant upon faraway resources, as we all are these days, but especially so. The water, once you get to the delta, and I'll go back and point to this image. This is the delta of the Colorado River, and I should say that's where the delta ought to be. It's really dry many times of the year now. So we, in some cases, have left almost nothing that gets to the ocean, that gets to the Gulf of California. So it's very troubling. Now, some of this is, of course, agricultural use in Mexico as well, but a very small part of it. It's very disturbing. There was a 2017 agreement. I want to highlight some of the positives, building off of past agreements that would invest in conservation, water conservation in Mexico, I'll point out, which is interesting, focused on conservation in Mexico because that was seen to be the low-hanging fruit. But $31 million is really a pretty small potatoes in the context of such a large problem. There are also issues with the shared Tijuana River that's shared by the cities of San Diego and Tijuana. And as the water goes downriver, it declines quite a bit in quality. And there's a great need for more treatment, but that's, of course, very expensive. And many have pointed out that we need better joint management, that right now we're trying to deal with it on each side of the border rather than thinking about this as a jointly managed river, or in fact, the entirety of the basin ought to be jointly managed. And finally, groundwater is a huge issue. Removals outpace restoration by a lot in both Mexico and the US. That is, the amount of water taken out of the ground far outstrips that which is returning to the ground, and that's a problem of sustainability that's going to catch up very quickly. We're not talking about, we used to talk about in the next century, and then we were talking many decades away, and now we're talking about in the next couple of or few decades, we're going to literally run out of groundwater. And of course, this is a story we've heard around the world in places like South Africa, parts of India. So it's not unique, but it's pretty dire. You can see the water supply versus water use graph there at the bottom. That's focused on the Colorado Basin, but the projected use far outstripping the supply. And this is made worse by some particular industries, often even when they're on the Mexican side of the border, driven by US companies. Constellation brands or Constellation beers, Corona, as well as many American beers. If you've been to the US and had some of the famous San Diego hoppy beers, IPAs, many of now are owned by Constellation Group, which is an American company using a lot of water in Mexico that is very, very much needed in Mexico. It's basically taking Mexico water, putting it in a bottle, wasting I shouldn't say waste with beer, especially in Austria, I suppose, but using a lot of water to produce less beer and then sending it back to the US much of the time or on to other places. So it's taking Mexico water and converting it into, by volume, much less beer and then sending it away. And when you think about it in those terms, it's pretty terrible for local people. Moving on to oceans, and this is a pretty strange one. I'm not sure how many people have ever heard of the vaquita. It's a small porpoise. You can see they're very cute, very disturbing news. I'm part of a task force with the Environmental Defense Fund, and when we met last time, we thought there might be 50 or 60 left. New reports suggest that there might be 10 to 20. One report said a dozen left, which basically means they're the walking dead. From a term in extinction terms. There's no way a population that size could ever recover. And rather than just mourn them, which we ought to do, we should think about how this happened. And it's a complicated story of overfishing another fish. They were not targeted, but another fish called the totoaba. And I'm going to use this case because it's so complicated and it's a good example of how complex these issues are. The totoaba is a fish that is caught almost solely for that grotesque looking thing. In Spanish it's called the buche. In English it's kind of the air bladder, the thing that allows the fish to regulate where it is in the water. And in China it's believed to be something that you can take to make yourself more virulent or more virile or masculine. In fact, even people who don't believe that in China sometimes buy these things just as a sign of prestige. They'll actually mount that on their wall, dried, not totally gross like that, but dried, just to show I could afford this, because those things, each one of those could be worth up to $10,000. And so you can imagine there's a lot of pressure to fish the fish, which is itself under threat. But the worst of it is the nets that they use. It's all illegal fishing. These are all protected, both the fish and the vaquita, but people do it anyhow, and the nets they use catch the vaquita. It's so lucrative that the cartels have gotten involved, and even in places where people no longer want to fish this, you have cartel pressure. It's kind of, do this or something worse. So it's a very difficult problem because it's already illegal. It's hard to enforce. A lot of it's done at night, this fishing. And even if it weren't so hard to enforce to begin with, you have cartel influence, which makes it dangerous to enforce. This is a very unique problem in some ways, but it ties into both the worldwide problems with overfishing and with the trade in illegal animal products, which of course we hear a lot about coming out of Africa with elephant tusks and other ivory sources. We don't hear a lot about the totoaba, the vaquita, and that kind of overfishing. There's also effluent issues coming out of Tijuana, and that has a cross-border element because it often washes up on the other side of the border. And so here you have a graph of beach closings, and the border the beaches closest to the border have been, over roughly a 10-year, 11-year period, closed quite a bit due to that. And so that's something where we need cross-boundary cooperation as well. This isn't a problem of one country or the other. These are shared problems. I think there's no better illustration of a shared problem than the air pollution and the localized air pollution. What you see here in this photograph is the border crossing, and they didn't wait for the worst possible time to take this photo. This is pretty common, this kind of backup at the border. It's worse coming into the U.S., as you can imagine, because of the, let's say, the way that the U.S. approaches border security. But you can see it's bad on both sides, and a lot of people might not think about the air quality impact of this, but it's pretty severe. That chart, I don't know if you can read it, but what you have is the types of outcomes that could happen, so ranging from mortality to various respiratory diseases. How it affects people, or would affect people, does and would affect people if there are no controls. And so the idea is that we have choices between relatively lighter controls on the Mexico side, US levels of control. And so you can see when there are no control, it hits the Mexico side of the El Paso Ciudad Juarez border pretty hard. When you just look at symptom days, which is days when people report respiratory distress, 38,970 versus on the El Paso side, 3,520. Compare that to if we had US levels of control. We could cut that number quite a bit. It's still quite shocking, perhaps, but when you look at the mortality, when you look at all of these indicators, if we had some way of trying to regulate this, which would include emissions regulations in vehicles, and of course, trying to do something about the backup at the border, because a lot of this is coming in the form of particulates. It's what you're directly breathing in. There's also ozone, there's nitrogen, there's black carbon, but it's a lot of, most of it is particulates that are affecting people. And it's taking a huge health toll. And this is not just true at Juarez and El Paso, it's true in San Diego, Tijuana. And something to remember is often the US side of that border is also filled, is mostly people of Latino descent. So this is affecting people in a very racially charged way, both on the Mexican side and the US side. And it's why there's relatively little pressure on the US side to do something about it. I'm embarrassed to say that, but I truly believe that if in my past life that I mentioned, I worked for a bit on environmental justice in the US, and of course you see the same thing within the US, entirely within the US, that populations that are most vulnerable are often vulnerable because of the sort of racist way that many in the US would approach this. They would not see a problem until it's a problem affecting white Americans. It is quite embarrassing to say that, but I think it's also quite true. And of course, there's the climate change, the zoom out to the macro side of this, and the huge, huge climate change issue with this much border traffic, much of it from vehicles that are not at all meeting any kind of modern emission standards. And they're just sitting there idling. It's hot. People want to keep their air conditioning on. They're all running the entire time, and that line can be hours. You have hundreds of cars at any moment running just to keep the air conditioning on, just while people are waiting to cross the border. I say this because it seems like a small issue to many people, and yet it has big implications. And so why not talk about climate change now? Why think about it when you have people dying of respiratory disease? Why care about climate change? I think for some people it feels so far off, but it's not. You can see projected change between 2021 and 2040 in precipitation. You see the darker the brown, the worse it is, and you can see the dark brown is centered often right around the US-Mexico border. This means a place that already has the water problems we discussed will be facing much, much worse freshwater conditions. So desertification and wildfires, which are already a huge issue in the region, are projected to get much worse. Along the coast, both the Pacific and Gulf Coast, you'll have sea level rise issues and flooding, river flooding inland. So some of these cities that are along, and many of these cities, because it's so dry, are along rivers. It's kind of crazy to think of a flooding problem in such a dry place. But as sea level rises, it won't be flooding from rain, although that could happen at times, but actually flooding from the rising tides. And of course, storms, especially on the Gulf Coast, change in the frequency and the destructive power of storms. And I leave this for last, maybe because it's always left for last, although for me it's something that's very sad. But there is already a lot of border obstructions, fences, in some cases literal walls. So the call for a wall, it's shocking because it was said in the way it was said, but it's something that's already been done quite a bit. It already divides many vulnerable species, and I go with what we say the charismatic megafauna. That is the big, cute animals. I talk about them because they're the ones that get people interested. So the Mexican wolf, lobo, the vaquita, the jaguar, right? These are animals that people feel. But there are lots of other animals that are less charismatic but quite important for ecosystems. And you might say that they deserve a dignity unto their own, even if they weren't important. They're a species, they ought to be able to live. It depends on how human-focused or environmentally focused you are. But even just from a human perspective, some of these species are keystone species, and some of the most biodiverse national forests in North America. People wouldn't guess that, but it's true. A huge amount of biodiversity in some of these places. And the walls that are now proposed, the wall, if it ever would be built, well, that's another issue. Maybe someone else is talking about that right now at this conference. But focusing on the environmental side, it would be absolutely catastrophic. You can see here in this map that these are all, each color represents a different type of ecosystem. And each of those blue boxes are areas that are really what we call hot spots of biodiversity, areas where you really have a lot of biodiversity that needs to be conserved, and each of these, of course, is already under threat by border obstructions, and a wall would do even more damage. Now, part of this series that we're in right now is it's meant to not just stay narrowly focused. I talked about silos around particular issues like ecosystems. We also can get siloed regionally. So I'll try to expand this a little bit out based on some work I've done in other places. So when I was in that past life as a human rights lawyer, I worked with an indigenous group called the Nobe, who live along the border of Panama and Costa Rica. And we were often fighting big development projects like hydroelectric dams and mines because of the particular human impacts they would have. When you're in human rights, you have to talk about humans. Nature, except for a few small cases in particular countries, nature has no rights. So we would try to stop a dam that would do untold environmental damage because it's going to wash out 5 villages. In fact, the last case I work on, I often call it the case that broke me. We spent a good long time fighting a dam that eventually got built despite all kinds of wins in the courts. That flooded away 5 villages. So I don't just pull that number out of the air. That's very real for me. And if this were another presentation, I would talk about what happened to those people, which is a very sad story. But what you can see here, and the reason I use this map, is the overlapping jurisdictions, the overlapping proposed economic uses, and the overlapping social impacts of all of this. So I won't even try, you can try to puzzle through it, but part of this is La Amistad Peace Park, the World Heritage Site, because it's one of the most biodiverse areas in all of North America. That's basically the green. And that's shared, it's a peace park because it's shared between Costa Rica and Panama. But that doesn't stop some actors from trying to make whatever they can out of it economically. And it's generally not, especially on the Panama side, ecotourism. Well, ecotourism happens, but it's not just ecotourism. So those red stars, which I think you can probably barely make out, and this is truly underselling the number now because this is got to be at least 10 years old, this map, and we have to have seen at least a dozen or more new dams go up. And when I say, I should have actually included a photograph, I say dam, you might picture something too small. Many of these are mega dams, very, very big. And you can imagine that since they're flooding out 5 villages that are kilometers apart from each other. They create a reservoir that's absolutely gigantic. Several dam sites. The one case I was working on was called the Chan 75. It's called that because it was along the Changinola River, and it was the 75th proposed dam. Now, that doesn't mean all of them are built, but just along the Changinola River, we had a number of dams already built and a number in the works. There are mining sites as well. And on top of that, you have huge indigenous population here. Well, huge not in numbers, but in the distribution. Part of what they have marked here in the stripes is called a comarca, which is more or less indigenous lands that have been reserved, like in some ways, limited ways, like the U.S. reservation system. But they're, as you might imagine, if you know much about this, the worst lands. That's basically mangrove swampland there. And most of the Nobe people live in the highlands and live a fairly subsistence lifestyle with a little bit of selling cacao or other products here and there for a few minor luxury items. And then, of course, along the coast, I say of course because it's so obvious if you've been there, but you probably wouldn't know this, it's just a lot of banana plantations, Chiquita, what was United Fruit in the past. And then those islands are now becoming tourist hotspots. And in fact, the people who got pushed out because of the hydroelectric dams ended up living squeezed between an open pit wastewater site, sewage site, and the airport that they put in hastily to get people to these islands. It used to be a backpacker place, and now it's become like a posh boutique hotels opening up. All of these industries, peoples, ranging from the government, the dam is being built by the dams are being built by American companies mostly. The mining is done often by Canadian companies. You have the government, those companies, the local people, indigenous and non-indigenous people. You have environmental uses and industrial uses and plantations, agricultural. You have, on the other side of this, you have coffee plantations. It's putting a lot of pressure on this border region. And I know a lot more about the Panamanian side where I worked, but you have similar pressures on the Costa Rican side, and you have those two governments wrestling over this. Another place where I'm trying to bring in a little bit of hope here, although recently it's been dicey, is with the Indus Waters Treaty. That's the treaty between India and Pakistan that's lasted, I don't know, about 6 decades. It's about sharing the Indus and its various tributaries, which originates actually in China, parts of it, but a lot of it, it's very, very remote China. Most of it's passing through India and passing through places like Kashmir, places that are fairly difficult political places, Punjab, and then it makes its way to the ocean through Pakistan. And the good news about this is it's a treaty that survived for a very long time, despite it being a treaty between two countries that are not always totally friendly and have fought wars without the treaty collapsing. And so maybe there's a model here, and there are lots of theorists who would suggest that water is the kind of resource that people don't fight over. That's starting to get a little bit debunked, but for a while there was this idea that people saw something sacred about water and would not fight over it. Now a lot of people believe that the troubles in Syria were almost directly related to a drought at the beginning of this decade. So, but this was one of the shining examples, 6 decades of relative peace around water, even when India and Pakistan couldn't agree on other issues that are much more, nuclear issues, for example, issues of perceived support for terrorism, things like that. The water treaties seem to hold. A couple years ago, there was a terrorist attack in Punjab, I think it was, on an Indian military barracks, and Modi, the Indian leader, started to question whether this treaty would hold, and maybe India would put a little bit more pressure. But so far, it has held. And so I'll wrap this up by saying there are multiple challenges, fragmentation issues, and actors. So it's not just that you have, of course, ecosystem fragmentation or the fragmentation of issues between air pollution, water pollution, ecosystems, but also fragmentation of the political actors, the social actors. You often have NGOs that are working on one or other side, and so that's a problem. And you have groups of people who are sometimes connected across the border, but often, and now it's being stoked, feel disconnected. And of course, the many disparities between Mexico and the US in a variety of ways. But there are ways forward, and we need more open and frequent dialogue and diplomacy, and we have sort of this 2017 agreement on the Colorado River. Maybe that's something that we can build from, even though it's rather, I'd say rather weak. We have the Indus Waters Treaty as an example, maybe, although the world feels a little bit less secure than it did a few years ago in many ways, and that's just one more. When I talk about bridge organizations, I'm talking about organizations that could build bridges across the border. So NGOs that are working on both sides. So this task force on the Vaquitas, which I hope will morph into something else regardless of what happens with the Vaquitas, is drawing from folks from Mexico and the US. We're going to different sites, and it's building those kinds of connections. And of course, that's just one area, but we need a lot more of that on the social and political, and even on the individual level. And incorporation of diverse stakeholders. So when we talk about joint watershed management with the Tijuana River, for example, we need it to not just be a political thing. It has to involve all of the stakeholders, including the people who would be affected by these policies, including industry, including NGOs. It's not that I have any grand suggestion that's going to fix all of this, but I think it's a series of small steps that's trying to bring us closer together. And it's a recognition of what's there. I mean, this to me is one of the most beautiful sites in the world, although it's not coming through exactly here. Appreciating what's there, but appreciating how much we're losing day by day. And there are so many other issues on the border. I fear that this is the one that's really getting left behind. But I'll try to strike a hopeful tone and think there are lots of good people working on this, and I'm hopeful that we'll find a way forward. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew, for your very interesting and complete presentation. Let me say some ideas, express some ideas, basically based on your presentation, because I didn't have the paper, but I believe that can be very, very interesting. Well, I am one of the persons that work on the issues of the U.S.-Mexico border. And for that, I think that I can realize what is the importance of all the things that you are showing today. First, I think that based on all the things that you are expressed during your presentation, we can say that if we can use an issue to qualify the region as a cross-border, is the environment. We have a lot of discussion, especially in the issue of economics, if we are really a cross-border or integrated region, because the difference of many factors. But in the case of the environment, it's very clear that we are sharing many natural resources. We have shared rivers, we are sharing ecosystems, we are sharing the oceans, and for that reason we have we are in front of something that Johan and I call like ecological interdependency. Yeah, like we have in the economics and social. What is clear is that in the issue of environment, we are in front in the U.S.-Mexico border at the ecological interdependency. I think that you are very extensive in the diagnosis that you present in these different levels of interconnection. Like you say, I agree that we have different levels of intervention in different issues. Depend also in the economic interest, because it is true, many of the problems that we confront has the base in the economic interest. Particularly, for example, when we talk about the rivers, we have very populated areas in both sides of the borders. And at the same time, we have agriculture areas, very extensive agriculture areas, and we have, and every time we have less disponibility of water. And what we are seeing in this kind of problems is that we have fragmented solutions. And also we can see, for example, how the power relations are expressed. Yeah, because, for example, when the U.S. Government decided to lean in the river, the problem was that this was how can I say, unilateral decision. Was not a decision that was shared, that was discussed with the Mexican government, and this created a big problem. Also, we can see that it has a result of NAFTA. We have this industrialization process, for example, at the border, at the Mexican borders, that create a lot of problems in the water, in the air, in all the disposition, the final disposition of water. And what, for me, at the end, the main problem is the absence of governance, and a real governance for shared environment. This is at the end. We have, like you say, we have a lot of problems in terms of the difference of governments. In Mexico, there's more centralized governments. In the U.S., more decentralized. They can take, the local governments can take more decisions in order to intervene at the border, but in the case of the Mexico, not. And this creates a lot of problems. And it is true that we have a lot of informal cooperation, also formal, but the problem of the formal cooperation is based on fragmentation, only in some specific issues and not in an integral view that are seen as very, very important. And well, for me, the most important situation at the end is that we had to work to create this governance. If we still having not this governance, we will still having a lot of problems. We had to discuss and understand, and our governments have to understand that we share this region, and all the resources, the natural resources, are part of both the whole region, the cross-border region. But I know that it's really hard also for governments at the border to understand that. And well, I think that it's very important to still working on and put all the areas that include the environment in order to try to find more integral solutions and not only a partial. Okay, but I think that it's very good to hear that somebody in San Diego is doing this kind of job. I don't know if somebody can do some questions, comments. Yeah, I need that you take your. It's because they are recording. Hello, hello.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Certainly very exhaustive in outlining all of the issues, environmental issues really facing people, ecosystems, wildlife along the border. I just wanted to speak about one element that you introduced that is particularly important to me, the idea of rivers. And it seems to me, you brought up the Colorado Rivers as case study. It seems to me that the primary issue is the degree to which commercial interests have, in essence, captured the commons, right? You hear this phrase a lot, right? That throughout history, rivers and waters have been defined as an element of the public trust, a public good that should not be monopolized or appropriated for private interests. And so it seems to me this is a historical problem that goes back all the way to the social and economic development of that region, the Southwest of the United States. So you coming from this from a policy perspective, to your mind, do you see a policy agenda either in the past or looking forward, that can try to break some of these corporate monopolies over really precious and scarce water resources.
Well, I'll say this is a long-standing problem that predates the existence of the U.S.-Mexico border. That is, riparian law, the law of how rivers are used in the western U.S., was based upon a very flawed presumption that whoever got to the water first, that is upriver, got to use as much as they wanted. They basically owned the whole river except what they let flow by. And so in theory, initially, with some limitations, you could just basically take whatever you wanted, and the further you were down the river, the worse off you were. And so this was kind of cemented into law, and there were lots of cases that over the couple hundred years of the U.S. history that were trying to redefine this, because that was not problematic when you had a sparsely populated area, but it became very problematic once you had many, many people trying to draw off of the river. And so I bring this up because this is the problem with the commons altogether. Actually, there is no, that famous article that you're referencing by Hardin, he was wrong about something. He imagined the commons being, this quintessential common grazing ground where a small village would share and one person would put too many cows on to graze or sheep. But actually, in those cases where you don't have problems, people are pretty good at regulating in small groups. As Eleanor Ostrom points out, it's only when you get to larger groups and those social ties are weaker that you have a problem. And so, we have two problems here. Just the general problem that there are a lot more people putting pressure on this system, including, and as Mitt Romney, an American politician, famously said, I believe I'm quoting him correctly, corporations are people too. So we have people and corporations putting pressure on this, so that's one problem. The other side of this is, now it's not only that you have a big, not centralized group of people, people who don't feel like they owe things to each other as small societies do, but you also have two sides of a border as well. So it's a complicated question. It means restructuring the way we think about the whole system. That's the problem. When you say, can we break the corporate monopoly, I think it's not something that you can do outside of restructuring the whole thing, restructuring the way you think about shared resources. It's not that the corporations are a singular problem. And believe me, they're a huge part of the problem, but I don't know that you can fix it by focusing on them. I'd rather build up by increasing, when I say increase the diversity of stakeholders, making sure that it's clear that corporations aren't the only or the most important stakeholders, but building bridges across groups and trying to get more stakeholders. I mean, there are way more people than corporations who are dependent on these rivers, but they're not heard and they're not interconnected. They're not brought together to discuss this. And so when we talk about joint management, part of that is making sure that the various stakeholders, including the private sector, but not only or most importantly the private sector, are being consulted. That's easier said than done, though, right? The short answer is, yeah, it would be great to try to take it. I don't know if monopoly is the right word, but to reduce the pressure that corporations are putting on the river. But I don't know how you go about doing that as a sort of a singular, sort of surgical act. I think you have to. It's a messy process of changing the way we think about the governance of the whole system, unfortunately. At least that's my thought.
Another question? Yeah. Let me.
You mentioned the example of other countries, what you learned before in terms of the experience of trying to solve the issue, right? And but what I see is that the case you mentioned were for similar countries, the same power. But how do you do with, you have a north-south where kind of all the rules comes from the north and not from the south. So that you have to do with the governance too. But that makes and more difficult in terms of negotiations. So it's kind of Mexico has to wait from the north, from the United States to see what could be the solution. So I don't know how much power Mexico has in any kind of these negotiations. So if you can just extend on that.
I think that's very true. And I'm not sure that there's an easy answer to that. I will say I think it's created a bit of a vicious circle problem of what's the incentive for, and you can pose this for either side, but because you have the power differential, what's the incentive for Mexico to worry about Tijuana River effluent when it's not getting any of the Colorado River, right? And so there may be an unspoken, why should we do this if you won't do that, a sort of, negative tit-for-tat situation. That's completely exacerbated by the power differential. Boy, do I wish I had an answer to that. If I had a good answer for what to do with north-south power differentials, I feel like I would be, I could die happy. That's how I feel. I would die happy if I right now, I'd say if I could just in a moment figure that out and then tell someone, and then I drop dead. Apologies to my wife, but I would die happy. But I'm afraid, I worry that the world now has this original sin that goes back beyond this, but you could keep pegging it back. But colonialism, right, might be this original sin that we can never overcome. That the way that the outcomes of the world were redistributed, or maybe they were based on existing power differentials, of course, totally based on geographic luck. I think that Europe had more resources Europe and parts of East Asia had more resources and were able to then set in motion this horrible several hundred-year process of making things worse for the South and in some ways better, in some ways worse for the North. And I don't know how you go back. I don't know how you set that backwards. It's to me, it's one of the great, maybe the great tragedy of the world, because it has such far-reaching implications, not just for the environment, not just for people and the social outcomes and human rights, but for our politics. I mean, you think about all of the problems we're talking about now, you can trace almost every one of them back to that moment, right? So all of the, the refugee crisis, if it's a crisis, all of this goes back to a moment where the world broke, I think, and it broke around or because of colonialism. Of course, that's oversimplifying things by a lot, but if I could put it back to that moment, that's where things started to break bad for the world. And so I don't know what you do with that now. I don't know how you reset or rebalance. What you have to hope for is that people of good faith are drawn to governance, which is a bad hope, because often the people drawn to politics and governance are the ones who are seeking personal aggrandizement and more power. But you have to hope that some transformational people of good faith come into the picture and start to set things right. But I'm afraid I have to say I have no idea what to do with that, except that that's why I focus on these little steps of building up, because I don't see a big step. I don't see it. And I think it is the great tragedy of the world that we find ourselves in this position.
Yeah, well, in the same line, for example, you talk when you are talking about overfishing, you are talking about the cartel influence, and we can extrapolate this and say, well, we had different kind of cartel influence. Or we can talk about stakeholder interests. That most of the cases are economic interests, and in many cases can be on the one side or on the other side, and can influence for not solve or to increase the problem. What do you think about because this can be very good way to see what is happening in reality, and how we can try to create some balance or some solutions, taking into account the economic interests of these stakeholders. What do you think?
Well, I think the issue with the Totoaba and the illegal trade of the buche is a good one to think about this, because it's so complex, and it's not just problem, a border problem between the U.S. and Mexico, or a particular problem within Mexico, or a problem related to cartels, but also a problem that brings in China and the illegal trade. And it's there that, since I worked on this task force for a while, and we've been thinking, what can we do? This question of, well, maybe we are trying to be too direct, and we can be a little bit more indirect and change the demand in China. And so this is modeled off of what, attempts with ivory and other illegally traded products in China, shark fin and things like that, is changing the tastes. And I guess that brings me to a bit of hope, which is generational change, that as new generations come in, the world can really change because they could see the world as an entirely different place. Old folks like me and older, and probably some younger too, are already set in our ways, and we imagine the world a certain way, and it's, hopefully we can stretch that imagination, but we're also limited by the world we know. But younger people can see it entirely, and sometimes they don't just have that possibility, they absolutely see the world differently. And I see this in my students. That's why I would never give up teaching. It's the only thing that brings me real hope, is to see them imagine the world completely differently. And in China, the demand for these products among young people is very small. There's no sense that you would want to put a fish bladder on your wall or eat it, or anything else. I shouldn't say no sense, but there's a very much smaller demand for that. And so that's the hope I see, is that these power relations, all of these questions, how we manage resources, all of that can change with the right mentality. But those mentalities have to change, I think, generationally. You can have some leadership. Hopefully, those of us who are still around to see some of these changes will have also had the privilege of being in leadership and helping these young people change the world. It sounds so defeatist to say we have to wait for the young people, and maybe that's a problem of we're always waiting for the young people, but that's what I see right now. It's the possibility for change rests in those people who would want the change, and not only want it, but also just think it's the right way, it's the normal way. For them, it becomes the normal. And for us, it's change. And that's where I see it. I have a hard time with these complex systems thinking, which lever do we have to pull, which button do we have to push? Maybe it's that the whole thing needs to be scrapped, and that requires, and now I sound like a revolutionary. I don't know if I have the Constitution to be a revolutionary, but I see some of my students, and maybe they do. In thinking, I'm not suggesting I'll leave that to someone else to discuss other kinds of revolution, but at least a revolution in thinking.
Thank you, Andrew. Somebody want to do another question? No? Well, then we will finish this panel. I don't know why the other guys, Aldomar and Couto, didn't show up, but I don't know, do you want to say something more, or it's okay?
Oh, I just wish they'd come, because their presentations look quite interesting. So, but I think I suspect, looking at the sort of titles, that there are a lot of interconnected. It looked like they were going to focus on South America, and I think we have some of the very same issues happening in Brazil right now, some of these border areas. So hopefully we'll be able to correspond with them and find out more.
Yes, well, thank you so much for the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for being here.